Good afternoon and welcome to the Nanovic Institute's panel, flash panel on Europe and particularly the tragic events of the past week or so. I'm Jim McAdams. I'm the director of the Nanovic Institute. The function of flash panels is, you'll be glad to hear, not to hear lengthy presentations by academics, but instead to hear some reflections which you can then comment on or ask questions about. We have four presenters. Margaret Meserve, to my immediate right, who is a professor of history and is a scholar of Islam and Europe, who's written a book, Empires of Islam and Renaissance Historical Thought, which has won many awards and is highly recognized. Ibrahim Musa here. This is in the order on my list, not the presenters. Ibrahim Musa has just joined us from Duke University. He's a professor of Islamic Studies, also in the history department, fellow of the Kroc Institute, and director of a huge project called Contending Modernities that addresses, among other subjects, interactions between Catholics and Muslims. Olivier Morel, who's an actual French person. A real one. He's a real one. And so he's going to give us the inside scoop. Many of you already know Olivier. He's a person of many trades. He was a journalist. He is a filmmaker. He studied with famous philosophers. And, of course, he's French. And then, finally, Elliot Visconti, who is a professor of English and a concurrent professor of law. Elliot is also the chief academic officer for digital affairs. And in particular, he focuses on First Amendment freedoms. So we're going to proceed in this fashion, digging deep into history with Margaret. I can assure you, not a single person on this panel is going to speak for longer than 10 minutes, and then we will interact.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me if I speak it? Okay. I was going to begin by talking about the traditions of representing the Prophet Muhammad in both the Islamic world and in the West, especially the medieval and the Renaissance West, which are the areas that I'm the most familiar with. And it may surprise you, it may not surprise you, but it may surprise you to know that there is a tradition of representing Muhammad in Islamic visual culture. There are passages in the Quran which suggest that image making is idolatrous, but there is no explicit prohibition on representing the Prophet Muhammad in the Quran, and there are plenty of examples of representations of Muhammad in medieval Islamic visual culture, and I thought I would just walk you through a few of these. There are, and I should hasten to add, there are not illustrated manuscripts of the Quran itself, but rather these come from history chronicles and compilations. Images, for instance, of Muhammad preaching. This is actually a later copy of what we think is a 13th century original, Muhammad giving his last sermon to his converts. There seem to have been some attempts to establish a kind of representational iconography for Muhammad that would parallel that of Jesus and also of earlier prophets in the Judaic tradition. So we have, for example, an image of the nativity of Muhammad. And you can clearly see the sort of interaction between Islamic and perhaps Byzantine medieval exemplars of that kind of scene. Images from the career of the prophet, both his original or first vision, encounter with the angel Gabriel, and journeys that he took around the Arabian Peninsula in the course of his career. Images especially of Muhammad in battle, because if you know or recall, a great deal of the story of the Prophet's career in the Quran is not just his preaching and his message, but also of military or political encounters that he'd had, but also highly stylized representations of spiritual moments in the life of the prophet. Above all, the story of this night ride. There are whole manuscripts dedicated to simply representing this story of his ascent on a horse or some kind of mount that had a human head, and the visions that he received in the course of this journey. Here's one. Here's several more. And just like with a Western saint, or even representations of Jesus in Western art, there's a kind of iconography, a certain style of halo that Muhammad gets. You can see the kind of influence of Chinese art, these cloud bands and flaming mandalas and so forth that surround him. So we have three different examples, but you can see there's a kind of established tradition for representing Muhammad in the course of this ride. And here we have even one that puts him directly over the holy city of Mecca and the Kaaba at the bottom. I think that's the last one. Okay. So we have a tradition of representing the prophet in medieval Islam. It's worth noting that most of these images don't come from the Arabian Peninsula or the Arab-speaking lands in the Near East and North Africa, where the original Arab empire spread, but rather most of these that I've shown you come from Persia, or even further east, Herat and the lands of modern-day Afghanistan. And it's not entirely clear why that should be. It may be that the Shiite form of Islam that took root in those Persian-speaking lands has long been more lenient about not just images, but also saints and shrines and other objects of devotion. Or it may be that because the Persian lands where Shiism spread already had a thriving visual culture. There's a whole series of ancient stories, the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, about horse-mounted heroes who ride around the Persian landscape, performing great feats. And it may be that images of Muhammad simply got slotted into that kind of heroic tradition and made a lot of visual sense to the people who saw them. Now, it's safe to say that the image of Muhammad in the medieval West was never quite as heroic or flattering as that I've shown you in these images. But the point I want to make to you is that the particular form or portrait of Muhammad that various ages conjured up tends to reflect more about the concerns of that particular age than they do about actual knowledge of the prophet's career or preaching or message. And I'll just show you briefly three stages in the development of that image. There is first the medieval Muhammad, who is renowned above all else as a source of spiritual contagion. He is a false prophet, someone who conjures up heretical teaching that essentially seduces good Christians and Jews away from their true faith towards a kind of false or bastardized version of religion, say the medieval Latin observers. There are stories of how he kind of cooked up his message using various tricks. For instance, these are all medieval legends, putting corn in his ear and then having a dove who would come along and seem to whisper in his ear an angelic message, but in fact is pecking the corn out of his ear. Here you can see there's the dove on his shoulder. Or tying a copy of the Quran to the horns of a cow who then happens to miraculously wander in and deliver the book in the midst of his sermon and so forth. So medieval Western Christian observers loved representing Muhammad essentially as a theological sham, and that's the story that we get. By the time we move into the Renaissance, I'll just remind you also in Dante's Inferno, Muhammad is placed in the circle of the sowers of schism. So again, his claim to fame and also his claim to villainy is as someone who splits the church apart and renders faithful Christians away from the source of their salvation. So his punishment is to be split open from bottom to top for all eternity. So there's a religious anxiety in the Middle Ages that by the time we move into the Renaissance, and the rise in particular of the Ottoman Empire changes into something a little more political, a little less theological. And the important thing to learn about Muhammad in the 15th and 16th centuries is that he was a formidable king, a great military strategist, a creator of laws, both human and divine, someone whose Arab armies rent the Roman Empire apart and destroyed ancient civilization. And the kind of parallel between the Ottoman Empire that was at that point the great worry in the minds of Western Europeans, and the Arab Empire of 8 centuries before was drawn out very carefully. Here you see a 15th century image of Muhammad sitting on a throne with a law book, essentially giving instructions to his minions, go out and destroy the Roman Empire, and that was what they feared about him. As we move, though, into the 17th and 18th centuries, that interest in Muhammad's political career begins to soften the portrait a little bit. He begins to embody even less of a religious threat and comes to seem like more of a political phenomenon that might be worth studying. So he's included in collections of world leaders, emperors, kings, and princes, and authors comment on him as one among many examples of rulers who rise and fall in the great sort of cycle of historical time. And by the time we get to the Enlightenment, the European image of Muhammad, you might even have trouble picking out which one of these three he is, but he's the one furthest on the right, has become so tamed, in a sense, that authors can really use him as they will, or do what they want with him. Voltaire's Muhammad is a hostile portrait for sure, but it's a portrait essentially of an absolute monarch, a despot whose irrational tyranny keeps Arabs enslaved in a way that enlightened Frenchmen will soon no longer be. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, Washington Irving's Muhammad is a kind of plucky shepherd boy who dusts the small town dust off his feet and rises up to lead a great country, rather like the George Washington of medieval Arabia. So there's a kind of softening and maybe even deflation of the hostile portrait over time. And what I want to leave you with is the idea that what these portraits reveal as they progress from hostile to neutral to perhaps vaguely patronizing is a West that became gradually more confident in its relations towards the Islamic world. From a real kind of medieval panic to a kind of Renaissance curiosity to an Enlightenment sense of superiority to the point where Muhammad becomes the stuff of folk tales. So if the Western portrait of Muhammad has changed over time, reflecting a gradually increasing confidence towards the Islamic world, then the question I'm going to put to the rest of the panel is, what do we make of the seemingly anxious portraits that we're seeing in this modern day cartooning controversy? Thanks.
Thank you.
So first of all, I would like to express my gratitude to Jim McAdams, the Kroc Institute, the Nanovic Institute, for organizing this flash panel. How can one read that? The reading of this event is far from unanimous. It is all very tangled and full of misunderstandings within the borders of France and beyond. Those who attempted to explain the trajectory of the Kouachi brothers or of Koulibaly have faced a common accusation in France lately, that of trying to find reasons that would soften their crimes. I see this movement as a sign of a great, unbearable tension, a social tension, a tension that I should confess I feel in myself. While explaining, contextualizing, let me get this straight, does not mean justifying or even worse, excusing. So instead of rationalizing and delivering a broad analysis of the situation, I wish that I would be able to do, but I'm not. I will provide a few fragments organized alphabetically in what we call in French an abécédaire, and I wish I would also be able to draw it for you, but it's not going to be the case today. It would start with A, like Aristotle. In his Poetics, Aristotle mentions the fact that the tragedies were originally satirical and light and not very serious, and then moved to something more dramatic. In tragedies, people of the same communities, often of the same families, kill each other. It would be also like assassination. The famous in France, Cabu, Wolinski, Charb, Tinius, and the others were killed not by a bunch of irrational, crazy fanatics, as I often read in the French press. And I say famous, I should put a parenthesis here. Famous about Wolinski, Cabu, and the others. In order to give you an idea of who they are, of the scale of the event for most people in France, I think it would be like imagining in the US that a mass killing would take place on a film set, for example, in which a dozen of famous artists and stars would get killed. Cartoonists are like movie stars in the US. In France, they are part of the DNA of the French culture. So they were famous. They were killed as individuals because of what they were expressing and representing. One of them, Charb, was called by his name by the Kouachi brothers during the killing. What we call here is a political assassination. No matter what one thinks of the quality of their drawings, whether they were insulting anyone and more problematically perhaps, whether they were insulting anything, whether one laughs or not, there is something that we will not overcome. These women and these men were killed for their ideas, their creations, their art, their nasty, in-your-face, tasteless and joyful humor, and their happy, disturbing, irresponsible anti-clericalism, as Luz puts it, that one can only understand within the French context and France's long history that would start with Rabelais, perhaps, through Sade, Dreyfus, and many others. That's also the letter A, like Ahmed. The video of a police officer being shot at point blank by one of the two attackers went viral within minutes after a bystander posted it on the web on January 7. It was unedited at that time. We found out later that this police officer's name was Ahmed Merabet. I quote his brother, that's Malek Merabet. He was French of Algerian background and Muslim, very proud of being named Ahmed Merabet, proud of representing the French police, end quote. Since I'm calling or quoting Ahmed Merabet's brother, I want to name another victim killed in the attack, that's Mustafa Ourad. Mustafa, I quote now, Mustafa taught many journalists at Charlie Hebdo how to write well in French, end quote, said the newspaper's designer. Mustafa Ourad was the proofreader, that is, the linguist of Charlie Hebdo, and was a great reader of Nietzsche, Musil, Dostoevsky, among many others. He was 60 years old, was born in Algeria, like the parents of my friend Janet Bougrab, who was the editor-in-chief's partner. B, that leads to the letter B, like brothers. The attack that started on the 7th was perpetrated by two brothers. I already named them. The Kouachi brothers were born in France. They never got to know their father and grew up in a housing project of the 19th arrondissement of Paris. Their mother was a prostitute. One afternoon, they came back from school, and their mother, who was presumably pregnant with the 6th child, was lying dead on the floor. They were 10 and 12 at the time, it's around 1990, and two of their siblings were already in a foster home. They were orphans. When I recognized them on TV, says Evelyn, the social worker who took care of the family for about a decade in the 80s, when I recognized them on TV, I cried, I felt irresponsible. And I felt responsible, sorry. As I was watching the US news channels myself, and heard about the many possibilities that these attacks had been planned by foreign individuals, or individuals trained in Syria or Yemen, I was immediately skeptical. None of the attacks perpetrated on the French soil in the 90s until now have been made possible by others than murderers who spoke French and knew French extremely well, from Khaled Kelkal to Mohamed Merah to the Kouachis and to Koulibaly. The Kouachis grew up in Paris, the heart of France. They were orphans. In French, we say pupilles de la nation, which means wards of the nation, of the state. As 4 school teachers pointed out, they also, like many people who held the Charlie Hebdo as stars, as members of their family, the brothers were our children. This means that our children, the 2 Kouachi brothers, have killed our brothers from Charlie Hebdo, according to these four teachers from the Seine-Saint-Denis. Those teachers, 3 women and a man, from the poorest district of France in the suburbs of Paris, wrote that this should provoke a feeling, and I quote, that has not been evoked lately in France: shame. Shame for the state of France, they add, for its way of putting people in jails, exposing them to perverts and manipulators, for the poverty of the French schooling system, for the way France handles its slaves, its undocumented, its nameless populations. That is also what Jean-Marie Leclésio, the French Nobel Prize of Literature, who lives in New Mexico, and Eric Hazan, the publisher, wrote. Now, see, like Charlie, of course, like cartoonists, constantly aiming at established powers, political parties or institutions like the church or the state, Charlie Hebdo expressed strong anti-colonialistic views and embodied the leftist mockery of the May '68 rebellion. The Charlie it made fun of was the highly mythical figure of French history, Charles de Gaulle, although some saw a bit of Charlie Brown or Charlie Chaplin in the satire as well. Huge stores are entirely devoted to graphic novels, cartoons, comic books in every city of France, and it is a journalistic form that was attacked. This revered tradition of the cartoonists in France is also related to the judicial scene, to trials. Mind you that Renoir drew during the Dreyfus trial as well as Zola trial, and that Tinius from Charlie Hebdo was one of the cartoonists who was habilitated to draw during trials, as it is forbidden to take pictures, talking about iconoclasm, right? Take pictures in a courtroom in France. D like division. In a recent article, the cartoonist Halim Mahmoudi, a close friend of Charlie Hebdo, pointed out that the newspaper had evolved in ways he disapproved in the recent years. He liked Sharp, the editor-in-chief, as a person, but he did not agree with his editorial line, mainly on one aspect: the fact that the recent Charlie was laughing at people and no longer with them, unlike what the founders of the newspaper did in a country, France, where, as you know, laughing at oneself is a national sport. And this should lead to a discussion about the status of satire in France's history, that is, the ability to sit alongside the powerless and make fun of the powerful. Some said that the Charlie of the past decade, including this cartoonist, Halim Mahmoudi, that the Charlie of the past decade also was betraying this tradition. I leave this complex reflection to you while keeping only one argument here. This is what I call the French division. France is a highly divided country, a country that is a lot like me today, at war with itself. The cohesion of the French society is at stake. In a country of jolts and beyond horror and solidarity, the 4 million who demonstrated on January 11 marked the existence of a massive social fact. This attack poses an existential question to the French society, and a lot has been written during the past few years about the risk of a major insurrection in France between the populist anti-immigrant obsession of the far right, for example, and the anti-clerical phobia of the left, as the sociologist Olivier Roy puts it, which happens to take place precisely this, at a moment where sociologically everyone, when everyone has a close friend or a relative who is a Muslim. Olivier Roy shows the juxtaposition of those two discourses and says that it leads to a dead end. In order to get out of it, one should take some stubborn facts into account. For example, youth who have been radicalized in France and elsewhere are deliberately breaking with the Islam of their parents. That's a fact. They are inventing an Islam in opposition to the Western world. They come from the periphery of the Muslim world. They are not sociologically involved with their local religious mosques. That's the case of the Kouachi brothers. They self-radicalize through the internet and seek a global jihad. They do not contribute to the Islamization of societies, but rather realize their fantasies of morbid heroism. The very fact, that's also something that we should think about, the very fact that 22% of those recently converted to Islam, including many French, we would call them Caucasians, right, here in the US, who are joining ISIS, shows that this radicalization is the case of a marginal fringe of the youth and not the Muslims in general. This is why I want to go back to conclude to the beginning. The fact that in every recent Islamist attack in France now, there is at least one person representing the French police or army in the persons killed. That is Muslim. Imad ibn Ziyaten, French soldier, killed by Mohamed Merah in Toulouse in 2012. The Brigadier Ahmed Mehrabet on the 7th. Imad, Ahmed, or Mustafa are not exceptions. They are the Muslims in France. Whereas at the same time, those who are taken as symbols of Islam, we see that on the news all the time, are the terrorists. That says a lot about our cliches. So I don't have time for E, F, G, H, but I will keep P to conclude, and I'm almost done. Like I said, that's P like peace. Like I said at the beginning, will this explain the horrible attacks? Probably not. But still something happens when we gather in this auditorium today. We read, we articulate and embody, as a political body, the tragedy. This is a tragedy, is not a rhetorical statement. What the four school teachers of the Parisian suburbs named our shame is also what Eveline, the social worker, describes. In place of the irresponsible Charlie Hebdo, that is their motto, right? In place of the irresponsible Charlie Hebdo, she calls up to our responsibility. Because we are responsibility, and this we is the name of the peace building that I wish will take place here. And I wish this word we here, students, teachers, scholars, in this beautiful home of peace on campus, will resonate. Our children killed our brothers, which is also the tragedy of Said and Sherif, the Kouachi brothers, killing the police officer Ahmed and the linguist Mustafa. On the day before the attack, Volinsky drank a beer at Nasser's bar, his Kabyle friend from Algeria, to whom he liked to recount his Tunisian childhood. Volinsky was an Ashkenazi Jew through his father and a Tunisian Sepharad Jew through his mother. Tragedy, I tell you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olivier.
And I'm circulating a little cartoon that was drawn by Eli Valley and that I bring to your reflection. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this event. Last week I was in Cape Town when this tragic event unfolded in the streets of Paris. The day after, there were rumors circulating that several international newspapers were going to republish some of the cartoons in solidarity with the slain journalist in Paris. A number of friends were trying to do damage control to say that let the malignancy of Paris and Charlie not enter the South African fray because it might rile up passions of Muslims trying to protest that again, or it might be throwing fuel on fire. My approach and my attitude then was that you really won't be able to stop the amount of indignation that journalists and people who are democracy-loving would have, and wanting to show and respond to what they think was an attempt to silence a freedom of speech. I think that some of my friends did not like it. There they told me that I'm making a fetish out of freedom of speech. 13 days later, we step back to take a more dispassionate look away from the heat of the moment. We try to configure the causes behind this event. I do not think it requires rocket science to configure the causes. In my view, we need to look at both the macro developments behind certain Islam-inspired events of violence and terror, as well as the micro events, namely the regional and European theater of violence and social disenchantment of Muslims, and largely the marginalization of Muslim communities throughout Europe. This is not only a French phenomenon, but this is also happening in parts of Germany. This is also happening in parts of the UK, with frightening proportions of Islamophobia, as we saw media reports. Now, I have a lot to say about this, but I think that very few of us should be reminded of this disenchantment of Muslim youth in Europe. A number of French, British conscripts to the ranks of ISIS, the Islamic State, operating out of Iraq and Syria, should suffice as indices that something serious is pushing them out of democratic Europe and into the arms of an autocratic and fascist-like Sharia regime in life-threatening theaters in the Middle East. Now, I believe that there's a larger background. I'm just going to summarize that larger background, and that is that these developments here have something to do with larger global unrest, and especially unrest in Muslim majority societies, that dates back in recent history as far back as 1979 with the Iranian Revolution. But then afterwards, another kind of major point was September 11. And then I think after September 11 was the United States and the European campaigns to occupy Afghanistan and Iraq, turning Pakistan and Yemen into frontline states in the war on terror. And these events have not only awakened monsters, but also resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands, and also in the process also destabilized entire regions of Muslim majority communities and societies. So I think that we need to think about two theaters, the European theater, and then south of the European theater in North Africa of a Muslim theater, east of it, east of Turkey, is the other Middle Eastern theater that stretches all the way to Afghanistan. And then over the sea, we have also noted after 9/11, we saw also events of violence in regions as far off as Indonesia. So I think that Muslim youth who have been fueled and radicalized by Islamic ideologies in several pre-9/11 contexts have had 3 decades to develop their agendas in very complex and fragmented ways, that now we see this harvest resulting in extreme forms of violence, and in ways that previously was controllable, but now this contamination is no longer controllable. These elements are very diverse. I will just mark that the jihad, that the US-backed jihad against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, and then that those collaborators in that jihad who turned against the United States. We've also seen that a number of dictatorial regimes, elite regimes, kleptocrats, and unsympathetic pro-Western governments in many Muslim countries since '79 and earlier than that, who have spawned generations of angry and desperate political Islamists who varied in spectrum from peaceful activists, that is political Islamists who are peaceful activists, to nihilistic terrorists and all those positions in between. Now, what I'm trying to do here is basically say that this whole question on the cartoons, many people think that it's about representation of Muhammad. Some people argue that this is about the question of free speech. I would say that representation of Muhammad, as Professor Meserve had shown, has a long history. The question of free speech is something that is endemic to democracies, and that these issues are, in my view, the epiphenomena of what I think are the core issues around which the Qawashi brothers or the kind of ISIS kinds of terrorists and groups like Al-Qaeda mobilize. The key issue is a historical doctrine that is a contested theological doctrine, which is a component of classical Islamic political theology, on the one hand, versus certain kinds of doctrines within Western liberal democracy. For Muslims, insult to the Prophet Muhammad and irreverence to his person, his honor and dignity is a major violation of the sanctity of the Prophet Muhammad. So Muslims are taught to love the Prophet Muhammad more than they would love themselves, their spouses, and their parents. And so the doctrine of imitatio Muhammadi to imitate Muhammad, is at the centerpiece of Muslim piety. So what we see here, that on the one hand there is this value to reverence Muhammad, an obligation to hold Muhammad in great sanctity, and on the other hand another value that says it is okay, one has the freedom to lampoon, to ridicule, to engage in acts of satire, and that's where I think the clash occurs. And what you do then have is that you have vast populations of Muslims living in Europe who have to some extent internalized aspects of these values, and as Professor Olivia Morel has pointed out, that there were cartoonists or people working for Charlie Hebdo, the others that he mentioned. So people who have accepted the new kind of values, but the large amount of mainstream Muslims do find offense to this kind of representation of Muhammad in a negative light. Now, as I said, that this doctrine dates back to pre-modern teachings of Islam, where Islam was an empire, where religion and politics were integrally connected. As in all other empires, you had other empires too, where religion and politics was connected. The penalty for insult to Muhammad in classical Islamic law was a death penalty. It's one of those exceptional penalties that is beyond blasphemy. And therefore you see that this penalty was the one that was announced in 1988 by Ayatollah Khomeini when Salman Rushdie published his book Satanic Verses, a book in which the Prophet Muhammad and his companions were lampooned and subject to satire. Khomeini just reiterated the classical law, and of course all hell broke loose, and then you saw a diplomatic fracas between Iran and several Western European countries, and there was a breakdown relationship. We also seen that the Jyllands-Posten cartoons in Denmark that also created kind of a global movement of protest and several instances of violence. The trailer, the trailer movie called The Innocence of Muhammad also elicited a great deal of outrage. Now clearly, this position on this doctrine is one that in contemporary times this doctrine has come under review by some Muslims, but not by all. The mainstream Muslim theologians still consider this doctrine to be valid, but many treat it as unenforceable since a proper and legitimate Islamic authority is non-existent. Let's call this the idealist position. Another group takes a different view of politics in modern times and have sequestered political theology from governance itself. This is possibly the position of most lay Muslims who live in secular societies, but while they might not invoke political theology or the draconian penalty, they will join demonstrations and protests in order to make known their wounded sentiments when the Prophet Muhammad is subject to ridicule and satire. And they would find freedom of speech and expression that allows their sanctities to be demeaned as an objectionable right. Needless to say, often the sentiments of this Islamic middle group is subject to manipulation by wily politicians and demagogues who try on their side, in order to exercise power or to express the power of the powerless by retreating to dogmas formulated in the past and doctrines whose social relevance might be questionable, but they do lend themselves to instrumentalization. And then finally, there's a third group, in my view, a group that either questions the evidence supporting the punishment and the penalty of those who lampoon the Prophet Muhammad, and all prophets for that matter, or those and those who accept the status quo of the separation of religion and politics. And they deem this historical doctrine as inapplicable and made redundant by a new social order that we now inhabit in terms of the nation state. But of course, this is a radical minority. At the end of the day, the resolution of this doctrinal issue is a Muslim problem. It requires careful review by credible Muslim theologians who would have to decide whether this doctrine is still applicable. Muslim theology has made much progress on several fronts, from questions of the compatibility of Islam and human rights and democracy to the status of women, among others. This one, on the question of the status of how to talk about the Prophet and whether lampooning and satire would be permissible, remains untouched because it's the most nettlesome, because it impacts Muslim piety and the question of love for the Prophet Muhammad. If Muslim theologians do deem this rule to be inapplicable, then they will have to find persuasive reasons to explain how they can express their love for the Prophet through peaceful protest and reasoned discourse. To date, very few Muslim theologians have mustered the courage to form a group in order to resolve or abrogate this rule or replace it with another doctrine and explanation. In the absence of relevant and a contextual theology, militant youths like Saeed and Sharif Kouachi, who become religionized, acquire a smattering of Sharia literacy, and they can easily access what I call undeactivated theological hand grenades and explode them by pulling out the pin at will, as they did in Paris on January 7, 2015. They often do not get the best literacy or teachings and hence succumb to these hyper and totalizing expressions of Sharia. And let's not doubt that they do so out of conviction that they are doing good and fulfilling a high religious obligation. Therefore, they also announce that the Prophet is finally avenged. Reports that these murderers led salacious lives and were prone to un-Islamic practices of partying and drinking should not distract us from the fact that these jihadis are taught by their handlers to blend into secular life so they can remain undetected by security regimes and agencies. Furthermore, Ahmadi Kulubali, a former ex-con, appears to be part of a growing demographic of people radicalized in the prisons of France. He, like the Kouachi brothers, are all part of a broader phenomenon of jihadi activists who are seeking a radical path of redemption to expiate their previous sinful lives. This is a widespread phenomenon, and they become easy prey to manipulative jihadi preachers in prison, over the internet, and through other forms of indoctrination. And needless to say, the attack on the kosher deli is, in my view, by design and part of a growing and an unconscionable anti-Semitism targeting Jews. This, ironically, is perpetrated by actors who are sometimes often the victims of another kind of anti-Semitism as Muslims or Arabs. Here, the responsibility to update Muslim theological doctrines that indeed do have explosive social consequences falls squarely on Muslim shoulders. I wish I could report that there is a serious effort at revising this doctrine. Perhaps in the aftermath of this event, the European Council of Fatwa and Research, with several very international heavyweight theologians belonging to that, would address this and possibly invite other theological bodies to support them in terms of re-understanding this. Lastly, let me mention that the asymmetry of global power and events in the recent past are clearly recruiting tools for such non-state actors like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Well, ISIS is now a state, whether we like it or not, of some kind. Better representative and accountable governments in Muslim majority countries are essential for long-term solutions. Western governments lost an opportunity to support nascent democratic rule in places like Egypt and quickly welcomed military rule in that country once the going became tough. Like the fragile ecosystem in which we live, the globalized world is equally fragile and heavily depends on interdependence. Non-state actors can easily destabilize the world, as we know they did on September 11, 2001, on 2004 Madrid bombings, on 7/7/2005 in London, and on 7 January 2015. But we are mistaken if we highlight these woeful acts of terror as standalone acts. They are linked to a larger score of violence committed by American and European armies in the cities of Afghanistan and Iraq and the nameless villages where tens of thousands of humanity have perished. Until we make these larger linkages, our remedies and analysis are nothing short of Band-Aid to heal a bleeding coronary artery. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So it's a tough act to follow, those great panels. Thank you, colleagues from the nanovic, for having me. So that we can get to our discussion really quickly, I think I'll just live tweet my remarks and we'll go from there. No, I probably won't, but I will go very quickly. So what I thought I would do today is provide some really brief context and frameworks for thinking about freedom of expression law and religious pluralism in contemporary Europe, in part and initially from the perspective of the United States. So what First Amendment doctrine looks like here. For many of the Americans in the room, this will be familiar terrain, but then also understanding freedom of expression law as it applies in France, in Europe, and in the context of European Court of Human Rights as a way of thinking about some of the free speech questions that are at stake in some of these questions. And again, I'll try and move pretty quickly. Towards the end, I'll try and offer a provocation, a statement, forward-looking, if you like, that is a conversation about the future of, an invitation to a conversation about the future of free expression in a global context, in a global media ecosystem in which speech, as we all know, speech travels instantaneously and borders and jurisdictions are increasingly permeable. That's not to say they don't exist, but they're increasingly permeable. So for those of you who are live tweeting my scintillating remarks, whatever you've just said is now available to somebody who's following it, hypothetically, in Indonesia or around the world, right? That's pretty remarkable, actually, just as a small little aside. So I'm going to start very briefly talking about the First Amendment and U.S. doctrines on libel, satire, hate speech, and so forth. So as some of you may know, First Amendment doctrines in the United States have been centered around the individual for about 100 years or so. It's a relatively recent phenomenon in U.S. constitutional history. Around the 1890s and moving into the first 20 or 30 decades of the 20th century, U.S. courts and state actors really organized their thinking around freedom of expression in the person of the individual. That is to say, enshrining the individual as the preferred subject of expressive protections, right? So the individual has expressive rights against the community, against the disapproval of the community. And so what we see in the history of First Amendment jurisprudence is a turn away from what you might call community standards or community-based standards towards a sense of individual rights, right? So, and some of that is related to urbanization and religious pluralism and the history of immigration and the flourishing of new forms of mediation. So the real rise and flourishing of mass media, the rise and flourishing of new communications technologies and industries, and so forth. So at the heart of our understanding of freedom of expression in the United States is a counter-majoritarian sensibility. The right of the individual, the fringe speaker, sort of the extreme speaker to say whatever they want, even in the face of the disapproval of the majority, the overwhelming disapproval and rejection of the majority opinion. So you could think of, for example, the Westboro Baptist as a good example of the fringe speaker who's constantly putting their thumb in the eye of the majority and is protected by the First Amendment. We protect the rights of the individual against the disapproval of the majority for a lot of reasons, in part because we believe in individual autonomy, self-expression,
the marketplace of ideas, the idea that some ideas, in order to become received, need to be communicated, transmitted, heard, and either rejected or accepted. Right? So we believe in the marketplace of ideas, of individual autonomy, and the value of speech to democratic participation and self-government. Those are all sort of deeply enshrined core principles and values that the First Amendment, the American version of freedom of expression, is enshrined in the First Amendment, right, holds out as its core principles. So hate speech, right, racist hate speech, for example, is more or less permitted, except in some very rare circumstances when it crosses over into incitement. So the difference between hate speech generally, categorical hate speech on the one hand, and incitement is the difference between, for example, I'm going to pick on you, Anthony, for a second. So Anthony Monta, who invited me to come here and speak today. So I might say, Italian Americans are blah, 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 and make a bunch of I'm also part Italian, so I feel we can go this, are outrageous, and I make all these outrageous statements about ethnicity and race and so on. Protect, I hide behind the First Amendment, I'm protected. Right? On the other hand, if I say, all right, you guys, let's gather up our torches and our pitchforks and let's go get Anthony right now because he doesn't deserve to speak and needs to be thrown out of our polity or killed, that's incitement to violence, and if he's harmed, I'm in trouble. I can't hide behind the First Amendment. So it's one very sort of, so thank you, Anthony, for being a good sport. It's one very sort of crude distinction between hate speech on the one hand, which we protect, and incitement to violence on the other. Right? Now, counter-arguments, and there are many counter-arguments from the position often of European, UK, French law against our individually centered version of protecting freedom of expression go as follows. The community, right, should not be traumatized or offended by the fringe speech of the minority. The cohesion, the social norms, the tranquility, right? The sense of togetherness, of community, is a greater interest than the rights of a fringe speaker to perturb that community. So if we are all coherent, we all have shared values, we all agree on certain principles, we don't want to or need benefit from hearing this fringe speech which is causing division, causing atomization, and is fracturing our sense of cohesion. So that's one argument in favor of community standards or assimilationist norms against an individually centered set of principles. Another argument is that fragile minorities disproportionately bear the burden of hate speech. So it's very fine and good for jurists and law professors and so on to say, well, the cost of freedom of expression is you've got to toughen up. But if you are hearing relentlessly, this is an argument against our sort of First Amendment, if you are a member of a fragile and disenfranchised minority and you hear every day that you are subhuman and that you ought to be deported or killed, that starts to inhibit your willingness or your ability to believe that you are a valued member of the democratic community. Right? And so this is the way the argument starts to take shape between a transatlantic argument, if you like, between a set of US norms and a set of potentially what we might call European norms, some of which are expressed in French and European freedom of expression doctrine. There's much more to be said about that. Now in France, as I think many of us know, enshrined in the very center, the heart of the French Republic is the principle of laïcité, of secularism, the notion that there is a sort of a secular, horizontal confraternity of all of the French, right? Horizontal participation. You can be French of Algerian extraction, you can be French of sort of ethnically as Caucasian extraction, etc., right? But you are French as a citizenship protocol, as an identity, which is not exclusively ethnic and racial, right? And that religious belief and practice is largely a private matter, that before the state, citizens are all human French persons, and that religion becomes a private matter. Right? Very different from our view of individual religious expression in terms of things like garb and so forth. Right? This is where some of the hijab, the headscarf laws in the past 10 years or so, have come out. I won't talk about that too much, but the notion here is that highly visible religious garb is a provocation, or at least is a repudiation of the idea of horizontal confraternity or of universal friendship. This is the argument, right? And so it's an argument again, say everybody is equal before the law as French citizens, right? When you push away that invitation to horizontal confraternity by separating yourself with garb and so on, you are sticking your thumb in the eye of the state. That's the argument. Right? It's a crude simplification of the argument, but that's an argument. Right? And so what we have then is that sense of in French freedom of expression law, right? We have that sense of this the transcendental value of secularism, right, on the one hand. And we also have a sense that there is no space for racial and religious hatred. So that and this gets very complicated. So the notion of group libel, the idea that speaking against a group, a racial group or a religious group, and inciting hate against that group is itself prescribed or illegal. Right? So that on the one hand, there is no blasphemy law. You can say, as many outrageous and scandalous and potentially blasphemous or heretical things about ideas or about the prophet or about religious doctrines and so on. But when you start targeting groups in a similar sort of domain of incitement, when you start targeting groups, then you are crossing the line and you are stirring up social unrest and violence and so forth. Right? And so that even within French law, there are a lot of complexities and divisions related to how freedom of expression is understood and is constantly evolving, right? And moreover, and a point that Ibrahim made as well, is that it is very, for many French Muslims, it is very, it feels that, and as was pointed out very eloquently, that it feels that speech directed against the prophet or speech directed against the religion, the sort of abstract or philosophical speech, is itself personal, is group libel. And so not only is group libel, but is in fact racialized. Right? So that racial and religious speech are one, and that the message overwhelmingly that comes, as was pointed out, is that Muslims are not invited to take a full role in the democratic processes of the state. That's a highly controversial claim, right? But that is one of the messages that is often reported and is received. So one of the questions, I think, we can dig into this a little bit more, and one of the questions that I would sort of take one step back for us to think about, right, is to say, in a world in which global communication is almost frictionless, is very low cost, nearly free, it's not quite free, but it's nearly free, in which speech can is transmitted rapidly across borders, that what is a provocative speech act in one jurisdiction may cross into another where it is banned and come into a third where it is celebrated, we may well need a new global way of thinking, a framework for thinking about freedom of expression, which is based on more of a commons-centered approach rather than an individual sort of state-based approach. And that approach, I think, needs to have at its very core, finally, not an individual versus a community balancing test, but the notion of valuing and enshrining democratic legitimacy at the very heart of any disputes or debates about freedom of expression. That is to say, even if you lose the argument, the fact that you are participating in a robust process and that you are honored and valued as speakers, right, and that you are made, you are given the ability to participate in that democratic self-government is the sort of transcendental value that I think the best that we can hope for, right, in these contexts. So I think that there's trying to give a very brief survey of some of the freedom of expression sort of differences between the US and the French context, and also a broader sense, as we saw with some of the cartoon controversies and all of the images controversies, which move so immediately across the globe, that we need to see these speech acts not in the context of French law per se, or US law or UK law, but in the context of a global media ecosystem, which is nearly frictionless, in which there is all kinds of opportunity, as was said, opportunity for mismanagement of messages and for hate speech, incitement, and so on to create negative democratic deficits, we might say. So with that, I will wrap, and we can dive in. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Elliot. Now we can take some questions now, but first you need to listen to my rules. Short questions. Please, no statements. And third, as is true to the mission of both the Nanovic and the Kroc Institutes, we always begin with students. So who has a question? Or who wants to begin? Yes.
This is for any of you, but how do you think that Americans or Westerners in general can be productively self-critical about our society or our endeavors abroad and contribute? How can we be positively self-critical?
Do you want to, the two of you want to delve into this deep question?
Well, as a Westerner, why is there silence? I'm an American citizen. I think we need to make the question of self-critical. I think that we need to look at the facts on the ground, and I would want to join Elliot in saying that we have to look at facts globally. What are the objective conditions globally? What is happening? A lot of our media and a lot of our news is subject to an ideological spin. You know, what we do elsewhere is part of national security. What other people do is part of something very bad. Okay, and of course we need to get that right. That will create a notion of self-critique. That's the message I give Muslim audiences too, not to only be so insular, but also think the world in which they are living. And therefore they need to understand that the world they are living is very different from the world of the 8th century. And I think Europeans and people in the West broadly need to understand we're living in a global world where other people have as valid investments in the world and the resources and the ecosystem, I say, that we have to be careful what we say, because it could damage our own interests. It can boomerang. So I think we're living in an age of the boomerang.
Thank you, Abraham. Next student, yeah.
I'm not a student.
Oh, that's, you're right, you're right. Let's get a student. Go ahead. Here, please.
Recently, the comedian Dudi Gone was arrested for some of the comments he made on the new Facebook. How are those differences reconciled, especially by American audiences who may not understand the differences between American freedom of speech laws and French freedom of speech laws that might lead to the arresting of a comedian for his comments on the issue?
Yeah, I mean, just really briefly on that question. Can you guys hear me? The issue at stake there was related to the idea of the group libel laws. Right? So, for example, in France, denying the existence of the Holocaust is a crime, as there are other group libel and racial and religious incitement and hate speech codes. And so the particular post that you're alluding to were captured in that set of doctrines, which we don't have. I mean, to the point, we don't have those doctrines at all, and so it really helps us to understand how different those two sort of freedom of speech protocols are, right? To see that there is, and this is true in the UK as well, which has a moderately robust racial and religious hatred act as well. So for us as an American audience, I guess what I would say is that, you know, we protect the right of the comedian to make, you know, remarks that are outrageous, right, or offensive. And we are erring on the side of protecting those rights against the right of the community not to hear the message.
I don't know if everyone knows who Dieudonné is, but I thank you for this question because I think it was one of the discussions, one of the controversy that was at stake during the attacks. And also it's interesting because the French-US discussion about this subject is absolutely fascinating. So I will try to put it in a nutshell. I agree, I mean, Eliot Visconti said it all about how hate speech is banned in France, to summarize, right? And doesn't fall under the umbrella of the laws that cover freedom of speech. In other words, very concretely, when Dieudonné marks Judaism, or the dogma of religions in general, in his speeches as a comedian, he's a comedian. That's allowed, he can do it, right? It's like when Charlie Hebdo publishes a caricature of the Prophet Mahomet, it's allowed in France. Now, it took probably at least a century for the Christians and the Catholics in France to come to terms with the fact that this was okay because there was not much to do there. They've been fighting these ideas. But blasphemy is no longer a crime in France, except in Alsace and Moselle, those two regions of France that are still ruled by the Concordat of Napoleon. That's complex. And it's interesting because on the evening of the 6th of January, the leaders of the Christian religions, the Christian communities, the Catholics, the Protestants, the Jewish community and the Muslim community had an appointment at the Ministry of Interior in France in order to ask the French Republic, the government, to ban the law that still punishes blasphemy in Alsace and Moselle, this part of France. In other words, you cannot insult religion in Strasbourg, but you can do it pretty much everywhere in France, apart from this part of France. Now, I know this is complicated, but like I said, when Dieudonné says Judaism is bad in one of his speeches, that's not punishable. When he names Jewish personalities and have the audience boo these names, that is hate speech, and he goes to jail when he does that. That is also applied to when we think about what happened with Charlie Hebdo, for example. They got indicted many times, including for the caricatures of the Prophet. They won the trials in these cases. The Dieudonné case is interesting sociologically in France. That's the other part of my response, because many of the I had to say the Muslims because I said this is not a community in France. This is more complex than that. But within certain groups of Muslims in France, there were also discussions about how unfair it is that Dieudonné goes to jail when Charlie Hebdo doesn't. So this misunderstanding is also taking place within the borders of France. Now, in the US, I saw many things, articles, that question that, but I mean, those who wrote in those blogs and articles were not as well informed and sophisticated as Eliot can be on this subject, and they did not know the subtlety of the rules or the laws that ban hate speech in France versus freedom of speech.
Thank you. Professor Morel, one of the issues that has really baffled me, and I would sincerely like your insight, is why President Hollande, after the incident, and his government responded with a global war on terror, especially in light of Professor Musa's comments that so many of the issues we're dealing with now, the rise of violence, is in part a reaction to this extraordinary violence that has been continuing since 9/11. But maybe it's fair to also ask Professor Musa, while there are debates among Islamic scholars about the proper way to respond or to reflect on and represent the Prophet, is there not more unity amongst Muslim scholars about violence being the wrong way to express concern about how the Prophet is as depicted. And Professor Desconsi, I'm curious that you mentioned French, U.S. Freedom of speech, but not international human rights. And I'm wondering if that isn't the answer to your question about global.
I'll just take it first because the answer is yes. I think human rights conventions, European Court of Human Rights jurisprudence.
Or the International Civil and Political Rights Covenant, which does it for the whole world.
Yeah, and I think just more sort of global buy-in to this sort of commons-based international framework, thinking about freedom of expression, exactly what we need. That's a question of state actors and political leadership in part, as well as jurisprudential solutions. So yes, but that's all I got.
So when you say Poland, the President Poland calls for a war on terror, is it a specific speech that he gave, or is it about his call for the international unity to face terrorism that is asked, and that led to this demonstration on Sunday 11, January 11?
English language media, including the New York Times, restated that President Hollande said France was now in a global war on terror.
Mm-hmm.
And since the only other global war on terror is the one declared by President Bush after 9/11, I assume he meant the same type of response.
Well, I don't. That's why I was asking, because I don't know exactly about what the bottom line is here. Whether it's a reference to the war on terror that was, that started after 9/11, or if it's one of his calls for a global unity to face this wave of attacks, which represents a globalized or a global threat, according to the French government. It's true that we need some clarity here. As far as I know, I doubt that President Hollande, but I might be mistaken, we'll have to probably wait until we get more developments on that. I doubt that the French president would join, if that's at stake, a global coalition or a global, alliance against the countries in which the financial support, for example, is provided to attackers like the ones who attacked Charlie Hebdo and the Hypercacher at the beginning of January. What I know and can say is that there were a lot of comments over the fact that right after the attack, the French Foreign Minister, Laurent Fabius, did not condemn the political regimes, including Qatar, that is known for having provided financial support to terrorist groups in the world, which was very shocking for many people. The same discussion, and I think we'll have to wait a little bit to see how it's going to develop, but there were many critics over the fact that President Hollande was able to invite 44 world leaders to demonstrate on January 11 against the attacks, and that on the 12th of January, when those leaders came back home, they were already banning Charlie Hebdo, or they were still, like, for example, a country like Turkey is known and understood by journalists in the world as being one of the biggest prisons for journalists in the world. That is not going to change. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think, the weight of traditions in foreign politics is probably such that we will not see major changes in the way France handles its relationship with, for example, the former colonies like Mali, in which France was military involved, like Afghanistan, in which France was military involved too. It is highly probable now in this situation, in this context, but I'm not an expert on this, that France will, the French government will find more support from its parliament. It's going to be easier now to declare war like they did in Mali when Islamic groups took over north of Mali a few months ago. So we'll see what happens. Unfortunately, I can't really specifically answer the question.
Let me answer the question you posed. I wish I could be the bearer of good news. So violence, directed political violence, there are a number of ulama groups, that is clerical groups around the world, have issued statements on political violence and terrorism in particular. We've seen that. We've also seen that against the rise of ISIS, a very highly, what we call into a kind of a blue ribbon committee of Muslim theologians globally, condemning ISIS and its practices and so on. But I think one of the things that we need to understand that this doctrine that I tried to explain emanates out of a historical culture that is very much based on honor. And honor is articulated in different ways in different cultures. And I think insult to the Prophet instills or instigates a response that is a response stemming out of honor. That will you tolerate your Prophet being insulted? Okay? This is in the historical records. And so it will require a whole re-education of first the theologians themselves, then their audiences. So it's a whole process of reconstruction of Muslim theology and Islamic reform that is invested in this. And so, for instance, even on the question of violence, you will see that in a recent book on modern Islamic thought in a radical age by Muhammad Qasim Zaman, he shows that in a country like Pakistan, when the clerical groups condemn political violence, at the same time they immediately mention the violence of the state that triggers that. So they try to be even-handed, but it almost gives it a pass. So what do you make of violence? So there's no absolute prohibition against violence in the rhetoric of the presentation. So it will require a different kind of stance for Muslim theologians to take in a very absolute ways, but the cost of that might be something that we need to calculate. The question of insult in the beginning of the 20th century, a very important figure in the Deoband school in India. The Deoband school is seen as having linkages or inspiration for the Taliban. I mean, Deoband is very complex. A man like Mahmud Hassan said that when people respond to insult to the Prophet, they should be thinking whether they are not responding to their own collective psychosis, and whether they are really, and their collective ego, and whether they are really showing love for the Prophet. Because he said, when the call to prayer goes off, all those protesters don't go to pray, or they don't show devotion to Islam. So he raised that question in the beginning of the 20th century, and as you were suggesting, is that there could be other ways of honoring the Prophet except through violence. And this man said it, but unfortunately no one took him seriously. And no one has picked up that thread that could open up a different kind of conversation. So this is one of those difficult dialogues that have yet to happen within Muslim communities. But as I said, all hope is not lost. There are people who are raising questions and are presenting different kinds of positions that there could be alternatives to.
Thank you. We're coming close to a conclusion here. I'd like to give each of the panelists an opportunity to share perhaps 1 minute's worth of reflection as we conclude.
Thanks. I don't have much to add beyond the pictures that I showed, except I think what I've heard from the other panelists that caused me to reflect a little bit is on the nature of caricature, which is really what we're talking about, and its uses, and the kind of social realities that those impulses reflect. So the images that I showed you from earlier European cycles of representation reflected a kind of insecurity, a sense of victimization or being under assault by an Islam that at that time in the Middle Ages was expansionist, ascendant, in many ways did seem like a genuine threat to the existence of Christendom, as it was called. It's interesting, I think, and still quite unresolved to reflect what are the impulses of caricature today in a West that is itself ascendant, triumphant, and what exactly is being resisted, what is being protested, or are these images that are being produced simply in defense of the principle of free speech? It's interesting to then think of the way things look from the other side, where there are equal amounts of a sense of victimization or repression, equal impulses to protest and resist. And I think picking up on what Ibrahim Musa said, the choices are to continually provoke on both sides, or to find ways of accommodation based on respect and a commitment to a kind of more peaceful mode of interaction. Having studied something like 1,400 years of this conflict, it seems like there must be a better way, somehow, to think about these interactions.
Olivier. Well, I was trying to find in my note a little paragraph that I copied from what a high school teacher from one of the very rare Muslim schools that exists in France. And this high school teacher was, that's why I cannot find it, but I will try to reconstruct it. And forgive me if it's not very precise. But this high school teacher talks about what he said to his students on the day after the attacks, when he faced his high school students for the first time. He came with a hadith of the Prophet Mahomet, in which the Prophet explains, as far as I remember, that he cries. The Prophet cries, and his disciples, they ask, why are you crying, Prophet? And he says, I'm crying because I think that my disciples do not have humor, and I think I'm in disagreement with them for the first time, and I'm very uncomfortable with that. And then this professor shows the front cover of Charlie Hebdo of last Wednesday, in which you have the prophet with a tear on his eye, and this sign above his head that says everything is forgiven. He explains to the students that basically this hadith from the Prophet was about what Charlie Hebdo is also asking for, which is forgiveness. Now, it's not saying anything about the huge misunderstandings, and I don't know about the interpretations of this front cover by Luz, one of the survivors of the attack, in the world. But it goes back to what Eliot Visconsi said, and I think it's extremely powerful. Luz, in the first interview he gave 2 days after the killing of his friends and colleagues, said, you know what, we are just a teenager, nasty, stupid, vicious fanzine magazine. We are not, we're not thinking about the broad world. We are talking to the French readers. And by the way, you probably know that before the attack, the newspaper was in extreme financial difficulties. This is really an old-fashioned kind of little newspaper, fanzine newspaper, that was read probably, most by 30,000 people. There are close to 70 million inhabitants in France. So it gives you an idea of what was Charlie Hebdo before. But Luz is explaining what disturbs Charlie Hebdo, what disturbs us, and what started disturbing us after 2007, right? And after 9/11 in general, is the fact that whenever they were drawing something now, they were thinking about, is that drawing going to bother someone in Kuala Lumpur, in Niamey, in Dhaka? They were not thinking that way. I mean, Cabu and Volensky. Cabu was a soldier in the French army during the Algerian War in 1958-1960. Cabu got radicalized politically against the military and against the colonial empire. As he was when he was in the military, he came back and he started drawing against the military. And of course, as Charlie Hebdo was kind of a Dreyfusard newspaper, also anti-clericalism. This is the context. Same for Volensky, who's a Tunisian Ashkenazi Jew. Cabu was, I think, 78 years old, and Volensky was 80 years old. It's a totally different world. Totally different world. And now, of course, the question is, what is the new Charlie Hebdo going to be about? In this context, when, as Eliot points out, whenever they draw something, It's like they were drawing on the walls of the bathrooms, right? I mean, the kinds of drawings that you see on the walls of the bathrooms, that's what they printed on paper. But it has a global impact. And probably this global sphere and this global threat, that's probably what President Hollande was addressing. We'll have to probably reshape all of our categories of thoughts here. And that's one of the questions that I would like to leave to you.
So, Ibrahim, if you would.
Thank you. Just three things. I think Professor Messer's last comment, I hope from her mouth to God's ears that possibility happens. But there's those same fears about that happens in European history. Today is being rechanneled. I don't know how many of you have seen a YouTube show, kind of documentary called Muslim Demographics. It shows exactly the same story about the expansion of Islam, several million hits, and talking about how Islam is conquering Europe, that I think by 2030 all of France will be Muslim, and creeping Sharia in America. Those same kind of fears are being retraded, and those of us sitting in universities, of course, we try to have a civil conversation, but what happens on the internet amongst Islamophobic networks and so on is really frightening. So I think that is still present. I think the second lesson that I get from this is that there's complexity. The complexity makes it difficult for us to grasp the tentacles of a complex issue like this, and conflicting values and citizenry, Muslim and French and other caught in between, and global citizenry who have different kind of sensibilities from a historical doctrine, and their responses to those are very, very different. So one cannot really generalize, and I try to generalize in some ways to give you a map, but they are not necessarily exact. Finally, I think that Muslims generally are also caught between multiple narratives and teachings of who they are and what they are as they live in the modern world. And so they are in between and multiplicity, and they're reaching out for pluralism and diversity. And I think if you go through Muslim literature and poetry, the great Ibn Arabi in the 14th century talked about, my heart is a receptacle for every form, it is a pasture for gazelles, it is the temple for idolaters, and it is a monastery for monks. It is the pages of the Quran and the scrolls of the Torah. That kind of plurality was also evident in Islamic history, and that's also some kind of aspiration that many Muslims have. Thank you.
I only have one thing to say, which is that I think that this terrible event, Charlie Hebdo event, is really not about Islam in a deep and fundamental way. I mean, this is a local event, it's a terrible event, and it helps us to articulate a set of questions where we're trying to understand the place of Islam in France and in Europe and so forth. I mean, so I think that one of the crucial things for us to do is to understand this as a set of local, highly analytically, approach it highly analytically as a set of local phenomena that are referencing Islam, and to help us understand a set of problems that exist. But I think it's always dangerous, especially in the media environment we inhabit, when we start, as was said, going down the path of these sort of hardened and crystallized understandings of Islam as a modern, non-Western phenomenon, and so on. To go back to a decade ago or so, there's a book called The Clash of Civilizations, the Remaking of World Order, which sort of made the caricaturish thesis that in the wake of the Cold War and the sort of bipolar structure of that we have Islam against secular Western liberal democracy, and that to me seems a very unproductive way of understanding anything. So to say that as we dig into the understanding these structures and the context, as was said, it's not only very complicated, but also as a prompt to us as members of a global community to find confidence in those organs of democratic participation that we can believe in, such as human rights conventions and so forth.
Thank you. On behalf of the Kroc Institute and the nanovic Institute, I'd like to thank all the panelists and